The broken wheel. The sickening crack reverberated, a sound that clawed its way into Martha's very core, defying even the wind's ferocious cry. The wagon bucked, a brutal shove against her frame, sending her reeling into the unyielding seat. Reins clutched in a vice of white-knuckled desperation, she wrestled the horses toward stillness. "Easy now, Bess. Steady, Maggie." The Maras, blessed their stalwart spirits, answered the familiar cadence of her voice, easing their frantic pace. Descending into the storm's teeth, she found the wind a physical assailant, flaying her exposed skin with icy shards. What had threatened as a morning squall had exploded into a full-blown blizzard, devouring the already desolate vista in a vortex of white fury. She could scarcely see past her outstretched hand. The cause of their predicament lay in plain, brutal sight. The front left wheel, ruined. Splintered timber erupted from the shattered hub like grotesque fingers, the iron rim a mangled wreath. An unassuming rock, veiled by a drift of snow, stood as the silent perpetrator. "No," she breathed, the syllable snatched away by the gale. It couldn't be. Not now. Not when salvation, of a sort, beckoned. A town she'd only dreamt of, a life she dared not fully envision, was just over the horizon. Still, it was something. Anything was better than the slow bleed of their failing farm. Her mittened hand traced the wheel's demise, rough splinters snagging on the worn wool. The break was absolute, irreparable. A wave of despair threatened to swamp her, rising like frigid floodwater, choking off breath and hope. She wrestled it down, clinging to her mother's fated wisdom. Even in the deepest dark, Martha, a single spark can ignite the way. A spark. At this moment, that spark was the promise of warmth, of sustenance, of simply weathering this white hell. Panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. She had to act. Scouring her scant supplies in the wagon, she found only meager offerings, a rusty hatchet, a length of rope, a scattering of nails, a hammer worn smooth with age, and a small saw. Pathetic tools against such devastation. Yet, she repeated to herself, she must try. Shelter first. She freed Bess and Maggie, tethering them to the wagon's rear, praying their combined mass would deflect some of the wind's ferocity. She offered them an apologetic stroke, a silent promise to find a solution. Wrestling her bedroll and a canvas tarp from within the wagon's confines, she tried to fashion a windbreak, anchoring one edge of the canvas to the wagon's side, utilizing the broken wheel itself as ballast. But the wind scorned her efforts, ripping at the canvas with savage glee, threatening to wrest it from her grasp. A futile struggle. Retreating, shivering, back into the wagon's meager shelter, she pulled her shawl tighter. There had to be a way. Perhaps she could salvage some of the sturdier wood from the remaining wheels to bolster the shattered one. A desperate gamble, but the only one on offer. With fingers fast succumbing to the cold's insidious creep, she began to loosen the bolts on the rear wheel, her movement sluggish and imprecise. The metal bit like ice, and the wind seemed intent on pilfering her tools. An age later, she managed to pry free a few planks. Heavy, unwieldy things, and the saw proved a woefully inadequate weapon against the hardened timber. Each stroke was a torment, her muscles screaming in protest. Daylight was draining away, the blizzard gathering strength. Swirling snow became a blinding dance before her eyes, blurring the wreckage of the wheel. Still, she persisted, fueled by a raw, instinctive drive to survive. 2 rough planks were wrestled free, their edges ragged and uneven. Imperfect, but something. Using the rope and the few precious nails, she attempted to bind the planks to the broken wheel, striving for some semblance of stability. Nails bent and snapped, the rope frayed and slipped. Her numbed fingers tangled in the knots. Frustration crested, and she choked back a sob, a sound lost to the wind's ravenous appetite. What was the point? It was all for naught. Alone, stranded in oblivion, with a crippled wagon and a storm intent on burying her. As darkness solidified, she huddled within the wagon, wrapped tight in her bedroll, the useless canvas offering no solace from the wind's assault. The cold burrowed into her bones, a relentless, gnawing presence. She closed her eyes, exhaustion dragging her under, but sleep offered no sanctuary. The shattered wheel, the swirling snow, the icy specter of death, they haunted her closed lids. Her husband, Thomas, flickered in her memory. What would he have done? He could always coax broken things back to life. He always found a way. But Thomas was gone, claimed by the fever last spring, leaving her to wrestle with this brutal land alone. Utterly, devastatingly alone, and the broken wheel now stood as a monument to her shattered existence, her broken dreams, her broken hope. As the blizzard shrieked its fury, Martha Ainsworth surrendered to the crushing weight of despair, her whispered prayer carried away on the wind, unheard, unanswered, and perhaps already too late. A lone rider. Dusty rivers squinted against the glare of the midday sun on the snow-covered plains. The wind, a constant companion in this desolate land, whipped strands of dark hair across his weathered face. He pulled his worn buffalo hide coat tighter, the familiar scent of smoke and leather a small comfort against the biting cold. He was 3 days out from redemption, heading north towards the rumored gold strikes near the border. He wasn't driven by greed, not exactly. More by a restless spirit, a need to keep moving, to outrun the ghosts that lingered in every familiar place. His horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Paint, snorted, its breath misting in the frigid air. Dusty reined him in, his gaze drawn to a disturbance in the otherwise pristine expanse of white. Wagon tracks. Deep ruts marred the snow, a clear sign someone had recently passed this way. That wasn't unusual. The trail he followed was a known, if rarely used, route. But something about these tracks felt wrong. He nudged Paint forward, following the trail. The ruts deepened, became more erratic, weaving back and forth as if the driver had been struggling. Then he saw it, a scattering of splintered wood, and the unmistakable impression of a broken wagon wheel, half buried in the snow. Dusty dismounted, the crunch of his boots loud in the vast silence. He examined the wreckage. The wood was old, probably rotten, the kind of break that could happen miles from nowhere, leaving a traveler stranded in the unforgiving wilderness. He scanned the horizon. Nothing. Just the endless white stretching to the distant, snow-capped mountains. He straightened, his gaze hardening. He could keep riding. The gold fields beckoned. A chance at a new start, or at least a distraction from the old wounds. He wasn't responsible for whoever had been unfortunate enough to suffer this mishap. They were likely long gone, sought shelter, or... The thought hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. He knew the dangers of this land, the speed with which a blizzard could descend, the relentless cold that could steal the warmth from even the strongest body. He glanced back at the tracks, leading further into the desolate landscape. They were old, covered with a thin layer of fresh snow. Hours old, at least. Whoever was with that wagon, if anyone, would be struggling to survive. Dusty ran a hand over his jaw, the stubble rough against his skin. He'd learned long ago that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone. But he'd also learned the pain of loss, the sharp sting of regret that came with opening himself to others. He preferred his solitude, the quiet comfort of his own company. He looked at Paint, the horse's dark eyes watching him with patient understanding. "What do you think, boy?" he murmured. "Head north, or play the Good Samaritan?" Paint snorted again, stamping a hoof in the snow as if impatient to be moving. Dusty knew the answer. He always did. He just needed to voice the internal debate, to acknowledge the reluctance that still lingered. He sighed, the sound lost in the wind. "All right," he said, his voice rough. "Let's see if we can find whoever left this mess." He remounted Paint, turning the horse back along the trail. He adjusted the rifle slung across his back, a sense of unease settling in his gut. It wasn't just the broken wagon or the tracks in the snow. It was a feeling, a prickling awareness that something wasn't right. A feeling he'd learned to trust over the years. The sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. Dusty urged Paint onward, his eyes scanning the landscape, searching for any sign of life, any indication of where the tracks might lead. The wind picked up, swirling snow around them, blurring the already fading light. He pulled his hat lower, his jaw tight. He was running out of daylight. And with each passing moment, the chances of finding whoever was out there alive dwindled. Hope in the storm. The wind, a mournful cry tearing across the plains, clawed at Dusty's face as he pressed onward. The snow-muted tracks, already tenuous, vanished beneath the ceaseless downfall. He strained to see, icy needles pelting his vision, a gnawing doubt plaguing him. Perhaps it was a fool's errand, a broken wagon and vanished travelers. Then, nestled against a wizened juniper, he spotted it, a dark huddle against the white expanse. Kicking his horse into a gallop, his pulse hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he neared, the telltale indigo of a woman's cloak confirmed his fears. "Hello," he yelled, the gale swallowing the sound. Dismounting, he secured his reins and rushed to her side. Silence met him. Kneeling, he gently shook her. Her skin was frigid, her lips a faint violet. Eyes, clouded and despairing, flickered open. "Are you all right?" Dusty asked, his voice edged with worry. She blinked, struggling to focus. "So cold," she rasped, the words almost lost to the storm. "Can't feel my feet." He took in the grim tableau. Exposure. Time was leaching away like sand. He wrestled off his heavy coat, enveloping her shivering form. "Name," he prompted, his clumsy fingers battling the buttons. Martha, she whispered. Martha Ainsworth. All right, Martha, we have to find shelter. He gathered her gently, lifting her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a sparrow's frame weakened by the elements. Carrying her back, he gritted his teeth against the strain. He settled her onto the saddle, supporting her as he took the lead. The wind redoubled its assault, a stinging, blinding flurry. Shelter. He recalled a rocky alcove a short distance back, a meager sanctuary but a shield of sorts. Hold tight, Martha, he urged, his voice tight. We'll get you warm. He drove the horse back, his muscles screaming in protest. At last, the overhang. A cramped cavity barely large enough for them and the animal, but a reprieve from the brunt of the blizzard's rage. He helped Martha down, easing her against the stone wall. A desperate search yielded a meager pile of dry tinder, his fingers stiff and unfeeling. He coaxed a spark, a fragile flame battling the wind's insistent breath. As the fire strengthened, painting her face with a ruddy warmth, a flicker ignited within her eyes, a nascent hope. Thank you, she breathed, her voice gaining strength. I don't know what would have happened. Dusty knelt, offering his canteen. Just a sip. It will help. She managed to swallow, her hands shaking. The wagon, a broken wheel. My husband went for help. Days ago. Dusty's heart plummeted. Days? The odds of survival in this maelstrom dwindled to almost nothing. But he kept his thoughts guarded, unwilling to snuff out the embers of hope in her gaze. We'll figure it out, Martha, he said, summoning a reassuring smile. Just focus on the warmth. He draped another blanket around her, feeding the flames. The cramped space held the heat, pushing back the encroaching cold. Martha leaned back, eyes closed, her breathing leveling. He watched her, his mind churning. He'd found her, but the true challenge was just beginning. Miles from civilization, the storm unrelenting. He was a solitary man, not a guardian. Yet, retreat was unthinkable. He'd crossed that threshold when he followed those fading tracks. A duty thrust upon him, one he couldn't shirk. He would secure her safety. He had to. Stories by the fire. The dry branches Dusty found crackled and spat against the biting wind, a defiant orange bloom against the encroaching white. Martha huddled closer, her teeth still chattering despite the meager warmth radiating outwards. He'd managed to drag her closer to the lee of the rocks, offering a modicum of shelter from the worst of the gale. Thank you, she rasped, her voice thin and fragile as spun glass. I don't know what would have become of me. Dusty merely nodded, his face grim. He unwrapped the thick blanket he'd been carrying behind his saddle and draped it over her shoulders, tucking it in tightly around her. Try to rest. Conserve your strength. He busied himself with feeding the fire, adding smaller twigs and nursing the flames. The light danced across Martha's face, highlighting the hollows in her cheeks and the dark circles under her eyes. She looked years older than he guessed her to be. After a long silence, broken only by the wind's howl and the crackle of the fire, Martha spoke again. I was a seamstress back in Philadelphia. A good one, too. Made dresses for all the finest ladies. She managed a weak smile, a ghost of the pride she must have once felt. My husband, Thomas, he always dreamed of owning land. A real farm out west. That's why we came. Her voice broke and she turned her face away. Dusty remained silent, letting her grief have its space. He knew the stories of dreams turned to dust, of hope swallowed by the unforgiving land. He'd lived a few himself. He went for help, she continued after a moment, her voice barely a whisper. 3 days ago. Said he'd reach the next town, get someone to come back for me. But the storm. She trailed off, her eyes filled with a despair that mirrored the desolate landscape around them. Dusty knelt beside her, his gaze steady. He's been gone too long. I'm sorry, ma'am. He saw the truth in her eyes, the understanding that had already taken root. There was no need for false hope. Tears streamed down Martha's face, freezing on her cheeks in the bitter air. She didn't sob, didn't wail. Just silent, heartbreaking tears. We had so little, but we had each other. He reached out, hesitantly, and squeezed her hand. Her fingers were like ice. I'll get you to safety, Mrs. Ainsworth. I promise. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. Dusty added another log, the flames licking at the dry wood. He needed to keep her warm, needed to keep her alive. It was the least he could do. What about you, mister? She asked, her voice regaining a sliver of strength. Rivers, he replied. Dusty Rivers. He rarely spoke of himself, found it easier to keep the past buried. But something in her eyes, a vulnerability that mirrored his own hidden scars, prompted him to offer a piece. I've been drifting. Looking for something, I suppose. Thought I'd try my luck at the gold strikes up north. He didn't tell her about the other reasons he drifted, the shadows that followed him like a persistent cough. He didn't tell her about the mistakes he'd made, the people he'd hurt. Some things were better left unsaid. Gold, Martha murmured. Everyone chases after it. But it doesn't bring happiness, does it? Dusty looked into the flames, watching them dance and writhe. Sometimes it just brings more trouble. He'd seen men kill for a handful of dust, betray friends for a glint of yellow. He'd even been tempted himself once. What are you looking for, Mr. Rivers? She pressed, her voice surprisingly gentle. He hesitated. What was he looking for? Redemption? Forgiveness? A way to outrun the ghosts that haunted him? A clean slate, he said finally, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. A chance to start over. Martha coughed, a deep, rattling sound that worried him. He reached for his canteen, offering her a sip of water. Rest now, he urged. We'll talk more in the morning. But as he watched her drift off to sleep, her face pale and drawn in the firelight, he knew the morning might bring more than just conversation. It might bring a test of his resolve, of his strength, and of the promise he had made. And he wasn't sure he was ready for it. The wind howled louder, rattling the rocks around them, a constant reminder of the danger that surrounded them. He added another log to the fire, the flames his only companion in the long, cold night. The perilous journey. The gale clawed at the cabin, a white maelstrom obscuring the world beyond the windowpane. Dusty lingered there a moment, his breath ghosting on the cold glass. The storm hadn't just persisted. It had intensified into a full-blown assault. He turned, his expression carved in granite. The wagons are right off, he declared, his tone devoid of inflection. He braved the pre-dawn hours, wrestling with the tempest to reach the shattered vehicle, only to find snapped axles and tattered canvas. Repair was beyond his means, given his limited resources. Martha, who had been silently contemplating the leaping fire, her gaze drawn to its hypnotic dance, recoiled as though physically wounded. The wagon had been their lifeline, their tether to civilization. Its demise felt like another savage cut. What? What do we do now? Her voice, a mere thread of sound, vibrated with a despair that resonated deep within Dusty. He knelt, his work-roughened hand hovering near hers before grounding itself on the aged wood. We're riding to town, he stated, his voice resolute, leaving no room for debate. Her eyes widened, the firelight mirroring in their depths. In this inferno? She gestured towards the raging blizzard, her hand trembling visibly. It's suicide. Dusty met her stare, his own unwavering in its intensity. It's our only recourse, Martha. Staying means waiting for the inevitable end. He didn't need to spell it out. The chilling reality of their predicament hung between them like a shroud. He rose and began moving with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to battling the elements. He gathered blankets, thick pelts, and lengths of sturdy rope. He checked his rifle, ensuring it was primed and ready. He moved with singular focus, a far cry from the aimless drifter he'd been only days before. Martha watched him, her initial terror slowly yielding to a spark of fragile hope. Do you truly believe we can survive this? He paused, his hand on the cabin door's latch. Turning back, his expression was an enigma. I wouldn't attempt it if I didn't think so. It wasn't a promise, merely a pragmatic assessment, but it was enough to bolster her spirits. Dusty pulled the door open, and a blast of frigid air and stinging snow invaded the small space. He braced himself against the onslaught, his eyes squinting against the icy projectiles. Wrap yourself well, he instructed, his voice barely cutting through the tempest's roar. We leave within the hour. The minutes stretched like frozen wire. Martha, swathed in layers of blankets and furs, remained huddled by the hearth, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm. Fear gnawed at her, a bone-deep dread threatening to consume her. She pictured William lost somewhere amidst that blinding expanse, and a new surge of anguish washed over her. Dusty reappeared, leading his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa appropriately named Stormy, into the confines of the cabin. The animal fidgeted, its nostrils flaring as it registered the strange surroundings. Dusty spoke to it in hushed, soothing tones, stroking its neck in reassurance. He began preparing Stormy for the perilous journey, meticulously adjusting the saddle and securing extra layers of protection. His quiet competence instilled a sliver of confidence in Martha. He appeared to know precisely what needed to be done, as if he'd weathered countless such storms before. He improvised a saddle for Martha, utilizing blankets and furs to fashion a more accommodating seat behind him. It won't be comfortable, he said, his voice rough-edged. But it'll be warmer than trudging through that mess. Martha offered a wan smile. Comfort is hardly my chief concern at present. Dusty fastened the last of the blankets, then pivoted to face Martha. Ready as you'll ever be? She hesitated, her gaze riveted to the swirling white chaos outside. I'm petrified, she confessed, her voice trembling noticeably. He stepped closer, his eyes locking with hers. I know, he said gently, but I won't let harm come to you, Martha. That's a promise. The conviction in his tone, the unwavering resolve in his eyes, lent her the strength she desperately needed. She nodded, lifting her chin with newfound determination. I trust you, Dusty. He assisted her onto Stormy, carefully positioning her behind him. Then he mounted in front of her, his broad back providing a bulwark against the piercing wind. He grasped the reins in his gloved hands, his gaze fixed on the obscured path ahead. A gentle nudge and Stormy lunged forward, cautiously venturing into the heart of the blizzard. The cabin receded behind them, swallowed by the swirling white void. They were isolated, two souls pitted against the storm's relentless fury, embarking on a treacherous journey into the unknown. The wind shrieked, the snow pelted their exposed skin, and the world dissolved into a blinding white haze. Martha clung tightly to Dusty, her eyes squeezed shut, her fate now inextricably linked to his capable hands. Eyes in the dark. The wind, a frigid harpy, shrieked relentlessly, threatening to fray Martha's nerves to tatters. Each blast tore at their meager haven, the copse of wind-sculpted pines Dusty had located. Tethered nearby, the horses snorted, plumes of vapor blooming in the icy air. Dusty tended a lively fire, rationing his precious wood. The flames cavorted, their shifting light conjuring phantoms at the edges of vision. It was during one such ephemeral dip into near darkness that Martha detected them. Eyes? Twin embers of burning gold, encircling them from the encroaching gloom beyond the fire's reach. Not the placid, distant gazes of deer. These held a hunter's hunger, a predator's focus. A stifled gasp betrayed her. Dusty, meticulously cleaning his rifle, froze. His gaze followed hers, features hardening into a mask of grim resolve. He saw them, too, a silent cordon of watchful hunters. He counted 6 pairs at least, with others potentially lurking deeper in the inky black. Stay close, he rumbled, his voice a low rasp. Rising deliberately, he held the rifle loosely, a clear deterrent but not yet a threat. The wolves remained unmoved, simply observing, tails tucked, muscles coiled with anticipation. The air vibrated with raw power and unspoken challenge. One wolf, noticeably larger, advanced. A male with brindled fur the color of twilight, displaying teeth in a soundless glower. He was testing boundaries, gauging their defenses. Dusty stepped forward, his gaze locked on the animal's unwavering stare. Back off, he commanded, his voice a low, guttural warning that mirrored the wolf's. Leave. Hunt elsewhere. The wolf stood its ground, yellow eyes blazing with insolence. The pack remained stationary, a silent, attentive audience awaiting a signal. A glacial dread seeped into Martha's bones. She recalled childhood stories, tales of wolves preying on isolated wayfarers, dismissed as mere fables until now. Gazing into those predatory eyes, she understood their chilling reality. Dusty raised the rifle. The hammer's click, sharp and decisive, echoed in the stillness, shattering the quiet tension. The wolves twitched, but held their positions. They recognized the weapon, understood its potential. I'm not afraid to use this, Dusty warned, his voice steady despite a slight tremor in his grip. But I don't want to. Just go. The lead wolf edged closer. It was calling his bluff, daring him. Dusty swore silently. He couldn't afford a confrontation. Ammunition was scarce, and a wounded wolf an even greater threat. He couldn't allow them any closer. He aimed the rifle skyward and fired. The thunderous report ripped through the trees, a jarring explosion that spooked the horses and sent a covey of snow buntings erupting into the sky. The wolves recoiled, startled momentarily by the deafening sound and concussive force. But they didn't flee far. They retreated to the fringes of darkness, their eyes still fixed on them, still ravenous. Dusty knew it was a temporary reprieve. He had bought them mere moments, and broadcast their presence to any other creature lurking in the vast, unforgiving wild. Martha stumbled to him, clutching his arm, her fingers digging into the thick wool of his coat. They'll return, won't they? She whispered, her voice a fragile tremor. Dusty encircled her, pulling her close. He could feel her shivering, her terror a tangible thing. Yes, he affirmed, his voice edged with steel. They will. But so will we. He swept the darkness beyond the firelight, his eyes hunting for any hint of movement. He knew he had to shield her. He had pledged himself to that. He would not fail her, even at his own expense. The abandoned cabin. The wolves' mournful cry lingered, a spectral echo in the wind long after they vanished into the encroaching darkness. Dusty urged his horse onwards, his gaze a restless search along the tree line. Beside him, Martha, swathed in layers, trembled. He felt the shivers resonate against his side. "We need cover," he rasped, his voice battling the wind's fury. Quickly, the snowfall intensified, each flake now a stinging slap against exposed skin. The world dissolved into a hazy canvas of monochrome, blurring the familiar into an indistinct void. The horse, head bowed against the blizzard, plodded onward, exhaling plumes of vapor. A sudden, stifled gasp. Martha's sharp intake of breath cut through the wind's lament. Dusty hauled back on the reins. "What is it?" "My foot," she managed, her voice pinched with pain. I think I've turned it." Before Dusty could react, she shifted, seeking a more comfortable position, and lost her precarious hold. She slid from the horse's back, landing with a soft thud in the deepening snow. "Martha!" Dismounting swiftly, he knelt beside her, concern etched on his face. Her expression was a mask of agony, her gloved hand clutched tightly around her ankle. "Are you all right? Can you wiggle your toes?" A shake of her head, tears brimming. "I don't think so, Dusty. It hurts too much." His fingers gently explored the injured joint, drawing another sharp cry from her lips. The swelling was immediate, the skin already blossoming into a livid purple. A bad sprain at the very least. Could be a break. A curse escaped his lips, swallowed by the wind. They were exposed, vulnerable, and now grounded. "We have to get you out of this biting cold," he urged, his voice tight with worry. "Can you bear any weight?" She attempted, but recoiled instantly, a fresh wave of pain washing over her face. "No. Absolutely not." Dusty knew the options were dwindling. With infinite care, he gathered her into his arms. Though slight of frame, the cold had rendered her stiff, making the burden heavier than it should have been. "Hold on," he instructed, his breath clouding before him. He began to walk, the horse following like a shadow. Each step was an arduous task, the snow a relentless impediment. His muscles screamed, his lungs burned, and the wind seemed to relish his suffering, its icy fingers probing every gap in his clothing. He focused on the simple act of forward motion, pushing back the encroaching exhaustion. Silent in his arms, Martha's face was pressed against his shoulder, her breath a faint flutter against his neck. He pushed through the swirling white, a landscape devoid of comfort. Just as his strength began to ebb, just as a dizzying weariness threatened to overwhelm him, a shape materialized from the swirling snow. A dark blot against the white desolation. A cabin. Small, dilapidated, undeniably abandoned, but a haven nonetheless. A surge of renewed determination coursed through him. He hastened his pace, his boots crunching a path through the icy ground. The cabin was a skeletal structure. The roof sagged precariously, gaps riddled the walls, and the door teetered on its hinges. But it offered sanctuary from the unforgiving elements. He shoved the door open, its hinges issuing a rusty shriek. The interior was a dim, musty space, heavy with the scent of mildew and decay. Cobwebs draped like morbid decorations, and a thick layer of dust coated every surface. He carried Martha inside, gently settling her in the least soiled corner. A corroded stove stood sentinel against one wall, its chimney clogged with debris. A shattered table lay on its side, and discarded newspapers lay scattered across the floor. "Stay here," he rasped, his throat raw. "I'll see if I can scavenge some wood." He ventured back into the storm, the cold a brutal assault. He guided the horse to a small, snow-choked shed and located a few logs, damp and decaying but potentially useful. He gathered all he could manage and staggered back inside. Kneeling by the stove, he cleared the accumulated debris with his bare hands. He unearthed crumpled newspaper and a few slivers of kindling and meticulously constructed a small pyre. After several attempts, a fragile flame flickered to life. He nurtured it carefully, adding more wood until a small, hesitant fire began to bloom. He glanced at Martha. She remained huddled on the floor, her face ashen. He knew they were far from secure, but for now they possessed shelter, a meager fire, and each other. It wasn't much, but it was enough to nurture hope, a fragile ember against the encroaching darkness. Hope's flicker. The fire sputtered, a fragile ember against the tempestuous wind that clawed at the cabin's aged frame. Martha shuddered, the faint heat a paltry shield against the encroaching cold. The initial surge of relief at finding cover had ebbed, leaving an ache in her bones and a hollowness in her gut. Beside her, Dusty stared into the flames, his taciturn presence a somber echo of the bleak atmosphere. "Dusty?" The word rasped from her parched throat. He turned, shadows darkening his gaze. "Easy, Martha. Rest. How long can we hold up here?" He hesitated, reluctant to amplify her worry with the truth. "Until the storm subsides. And if it doesn't?" He averted his gaze. Their meager store of jerky, culled from what he'd managed to salvage, dwindled with alarming speed. He'd portioned it scrupulously, but it barely offered sustenance for more than a day, perhaps two. Martha needed far more than dried meat. She required nourishment to mend her injured ankle and resist the creeping chill. "We'll manage," he vowed, injecting a false lilt into his tone. The reassurance sounded threadbare even to him. He drew the worn blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Try to sleep. Conserve what strength you have." Her eyes closed, her face gone. He lingered, his heart burdened by a mix of tenderness and an unfamiliar, fierce protectiveness. Starvation would not claim her. He wouldn't allow it. Again, the wind howled, a forlorn lament that mirrored the despair within the humble dwelling. He rose abruptly. "Where are you going?" Martha murmured, her eyes fluttering open. "Just checking around," he replied, seizing his rifle. "Seeing if the perimeter is secure." He avoided her gaze, knowing she suspected his deception. The full truth, a desperate hunt into the blizzard's heart, armed with little more than hope and a dwindling supply of cartridges, remained unspoken. He shoved the door open, the gale instantly assaulting him, pelting his face with icy shards. The world had dissolved into a swirling, white oblivion, visibility reduced to mere yards. He secured his fur hat and braved the storm's fury. He advanced slowly, warily, the rifle at the ready. The wind lashed him, threatening to topple him. He surveyed the snow cape, searching for any sign of life, any hint of quarry. The snowfall muffled all sound, heightening the solitary dread. Hours bled into one another. Numbness crept into his fingers, his face felt like glass. Doubt nodded him. Was this a fool's errand, a trajectory leading only to his own demise? As he contemplated turning back, defeated, he spotted it. A flicker of brown against the relentless white, a small rabbit seeking shelter beneath a snow-laden thicket. He stilled, his heart hammering against his ribs. Slowly, deliberately, he raised the rifle, his breath forming fleeting clouds in the frozen air. He aimed, his finger compressing the trigger. The shot cracked through the storm. Approaching with caution, his eyes peeled for danger, he discovered the rabbit, still in the snow, felled by a clean shot. A wave of relief washed over him, so profound it nearly buckled his knees. Gathering the rabbit, its fur still retaining warmth, he knew it wasn't much, but it was life. Sustenance for another day at least. The return journey proved an ordeal. The wind seemed to have redoubled its assault, the snow falling with renewed ferocity. He stumbled numerous times, each fall threatening to wrest his precious prize from his grasp. At last, he discerned it. The faint luminescence emanating from the cabin window, a beacon in the tempest. He forced the door open, collapsing inside, a swirl of snow and wind accompanying his entry. Martha pushed herself up, eyes wide with apprehension. "Dusty? What happened?" He raised the rabbit, a triumphant grin briefly cutting through his frozen features. "Supper," he croaked. Tears welled in her eyes. You went out in that." He nodded, too depleted to answer further. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they touched his face. "Thank you," she breathed. "Thank you." He managed a weak smile. "Don't thank me yet. I still have to cook it." With sluggish, precise movements, he set about preparing the rabbit. He skinned and gutted it, the firelight painting dancing silhouettes across the cabin walls. Martha watched him, her gaze a fusion of gratitude and worry. Soon, the aroma of roasting meat permeated the tiny space, a welcome fragrance that dispelled the oppressive sense of damp wood and despair. They ate in silence, each mouthful savored. A meager meal, certainly, but sufficient. Enough to quell their hunger, enough to kindle a fragile spark of hope against the encroaching darkness. When they had finished, Dusty banked the fire and settled beside Martha. She had already succumbed to sleep, her breathing shallow and regular. He studied her for a long while, his thoughts a tangle of emotions. He couldn't foresee what lay ahead, but one conviction burned within him: he would safeguard her with every fiber of his being. He owed her that much at the very least. The storm breaks. The silence registered first, a stark contrast to the blizzard's brutal symphony. Not merely an absence of noise, but a profound hush that followed the storm's furious assault. Martha stirred, her limbs protesting with aches, and blinked against a square of pale, almost painful light where the window had been a swirling white chaos. Sitting up brought a sharp lance of pain from her ankle. Dusty, already awake, sat motionless by the newly stoked fire, his form etched sharply against the luminous window pane. He remained still and silent, as if not wanting to dispel the stillness. Then a sound broke through. A bird's song, hesitant at first, then growing stronger, a delicate thread of melody woven into the vast, white cathedral left by the tempest. It stopped, Martha rasped, her voice raspy. Dusty gave a curt nod, finally turning. His eyes, usually veiled and cautious, flickered with something unfamiliar, a nascent hope, perhaps, or simply relief. "It has." He rose and crossed to the window, peering at the transformed world. "Clear as glass. But the cold, it'll bite right through you." Martha pushed herself upright, using a crude table for support. The cabin felt diminished, less a haven and more a temporary confinement. She limped to the window and drew a breath. The world had been remade. Snowdrifts, sculpted by the gale, swelled like frozen billows. Trees, heavy with snow, dipped their boughs, each branch a glittering crystal spray. The landscape offered a majestic, if severe, beauty. "We need to move," Dusty stated, his tone pragmatic. "Before another one rolls in." Martha's spirits dipped. Leaving the fragile security of the cabin was a daunting prospect, yet she knew his assessment rang true. They couldn't linger here indefinitely. Already, Dusty was gathering their threadbare possessions. He assessed the rabbit, now frozen hard, and carefully wrapped it. He then returned with thick socks. "Layer these over yours. Might help some." Martha accepted them gratefully. Each movement of her injured ankle reverberated with a throbbing ache, a stark reminder of her precarious state. Dusty noticed her wince. "Easy now," he murmured, his voice gentler than usual. He knelt, his touch surprisingly delicate as he examined her ankle. "Still swollen. We'll have to pace ourselves." He delved into his pack and produced a strip of leather. He carefully bound her ankle, lending what support he could. The touch of his calloused hands was surprisingly tender and sure. "That'll give it some stability," he said, rising to his feet. "Still, be careful." He saddled the horse, his movements economical and practiced. The animal shifted restlessly, its breath clouding in the frigid air. Helping Martha mount proved difficult. She cried out as she put her weight down. Dusty steadied her, his strength a palpable support. With unexpected ease, he lifted her into the saddle, his gaze locking briefly with hers in an intense, unspoken communication. "Hold tight," he advised, his voice a low rumble. He swung up behind her, his presence a solid, reassuring weight. The horse plodded forward through the thick snow, its hooves sinking deeply. The sun, a pale coin in the azure sky, cast long, stark shadows across the untouched expanse. The air, crisp and bracing, stung their exposed skin. Martha pulled her scarf tighter, appreciating the warmth radiating from Dusty's body behind her. They advanced in silence, accompanied only by the rhythmic crunch of hooves and the occasional call of a distant bird. After an hour, Dusty spoke, his breath a warm puff against her ear. "We should hit the old logging trail by midday. Easier footing there." Martha nodded, offering no reply. She was wholly consumed by managing the relentless throb in her ankle and the piercing cold. But underneath the discomfort, a small ember of hope began to glow. The storm had broken. The sun provided some warmth. And they were advancing. As they continued their journey, the terrain began to shift. The dense trees gradually thinned, giving way to a more open landscape of gently rolling hills blanketed in white. In the distance, Martha glimpsed the spectral forms of mountains, their peaks veiled in mist. The sun ascended higher, its meager warmth slowly filtering through their layers of clothing. Martha closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the faint warmth. It seemed a minor triumph, yet it provided a sense of strength. They rode on in silence, their shared ordeal forging a connection deeper than any conversation. Martha understood that the days ahead would be long and hard, but for the first time since her husband's accident, she registered a small flicker of optimism. She wasn't completely alone, and she refused to surrender. Safe harbor. A solitary plume of smoke, etching itself against the washed-out sky, announced their arrival. Martha's breath hitched. Days bled white by the blizzard, punctuated only by the incessant dread coiled tight in her gut, now gave way to something tangible. "Dusty," she rasped, her voice a dry rasp. "Smoke." Dusty, who had been forging ahead, halted, his gaze following hers. An emotion flickered across his features, something too fleeting to decipher, before settling back into his customary reserve. "Havenwood," he affirmed, his voice gravelly. "Almost there." The phrase echoed within her, planting a seed of tenuous hope. Her ankle pulsed with a dull throb, a persistent reminder of her fragility. Yet the prospect of warmth, sanctuary, and human connection propelled her forward. Cresting the final rise, the town unfurled below, a scattering of snow-dusted structures, a beacon in the vast, frozen expanse. Figures bustled, clearing paths, tending to pen livestock, the everyday rhythms of life that had felt impossibly distant. A shout broke the stillness. A man, swaddled in layers of fur and wool, broke from a small cluster and hurried towards them. "Martha? Martha Ainsworth, is that really you?" It was Thomas, the baker, his face creased with worry. We feared. We feared the worst. He rushed to her side, his gaze sweeping over her gaunt frame. Good heavens, child, you're half frozen. And your ankle. I'm fine, Thomas, Martha managed, her voice shaky. Thanks to Dusty. She inclined her head towards him. Thomas turned, relief flooding his features. Dusty Rivers? We heard you went after her. We owe you a debt beyond words, son. More townsfolk emerged, their faces mirroring Thomas's profound relief. They gathered around Martha, their voices a soothing hum, their hands gentle as they offered support. Dusty remained on the periphery, a silent sentinel, his eyes scanning the surroundings. Sarah Miller's got a roaring fire going in her mercantile, Thomas said, gently steering Martha forward. She'll get you right as rain. Miller's mercantile was a sanctuary of warmth and light. The mingled sense of cinnamon and wood smoke assaulted Martha's senses in the most comforting way. Sarah, a woman whose face radiated warmth and competence, rushed forward, enveloping Martha in a fierce hug. Martha, dear girl, we were beside ourselves. Come. Sit by the hearth. Let me fetch you some broth. Martha gratefully sank into a chair beside the crackling fire, its heat leaching into her numb limbs. Sarah hovered, her brow furrowed with concern as she gently examined the injured ankle. A steaming bowl of broth materialized, and Martha gratefully swallowed it down, the warmth chasing away the lingering chill. Outside the mercantile, Sheriff Brody approached Dusty. He was a broad-shouldered man, his face etched with the harsh lines of the frontier, his gaze unwavering. Dusty, he said, extending a calloused hand. I owe you more than thanks. You risked everything for Martha. This town won't forget that kindness. Dusty hesitated a moment before shaking his hand, his grip firm. She needed help, he replied simply, avoiding the sheriff's gaze. You did more than help, son. You brought her home. There's been whispers about you since you rode into town, about why you left your past behind. But this changes things. You showed us your true character. Dusty remained impassive. The sheriff clapped him on the shoulder. Come on, let me buy you a drink at the saloon. Let the town express its gratitude properly. Dusty hesitated, glancing back towards the mercantile. I should check on Martha. Sarah has her in good hands, Brody reassured him. She's receiving the best care imaginable. Come on, Dusty. You deserve some warmth and company yourself. Relenting, Dusty followed the sheriff towards the saloon, the sheriff's words resonating within him. He had never sought accolades, never expected commendation. He had simply acted as his conscience dictated. But the sheriff's sentiment, the undisguised gratitude in his gaze, sparked something nascent within him, a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he could carve out a place for himself in this close-knit community. Inside the mercantile, Martha sipped her broth, allowing the warmth of the fire and Sarah's compassion to fortify her. She glanced out the window, watching Dusty and the sheriff head towards the saloon, a faint smile gracing her lips. The future remained uncertain, but for the first time in weeks, she felt a tentative stirring of hope. She was secure. She was warm. She was alive. And she owed it all to the reticent man who had jeopardized his own well-being to save her. The weight of her bereavement persisted, a dull ache in her spirit, but it no longer consumed her utterly. Space had been made alongside it, a space filled with thankfulness, with a budding sense of what might be. Perhaps in this unassuming town, nurtured by the generosity of strangers, she could begin to heal, to piece her life back together, to discover a renewed sense of purpose. And perhaps, just perhaps, Dusty Rivers might find his own safe haven as well.